As a community moves towards despotism, respect is restricted to fewer people. A community is low on a respect scale if common courtesy is withheld from large groups of people on account of their political attitudes. If people are rude to others because they think their wealth and position gives them that right, or because they don't like a man's race or his religion. Equal opportunity for all citizens to develop useful skills is one basis for rating a community on a respect scale. The opportunity to develop useful skills is important, but not enough. The equally important opportunity to put skills to use is a further test on a respect scale. A power scale is another important yardstick of despotism. It gauges the citizens' share in making the community's decisions. Communities which concentrate decision-making in a few hands rate low on a power scale and are moving towards despotism. Like France under the Bourbon kings, one of whom said, "The state, I am the state." Today, democracy can ebb away in communities whose citizens allow power to become concentrated in the hands of bosses.
What I say goes, see? I'm the law around here.
The test of despotic power is that it can disregard the will of the people. It rules without the consent of the governed. Look beyond the legal formalities of an election in measuring a community on the power scale to see if the ballot is really free. If the citizens can vote only the way they're told, a community approaches despotism. When legislatures become ceremonial assemblies only and have no real control over lawmaking, their community rates low on a power scale. In a downright despotism, opposition is dangerous whether the despotism is official or whether it is unofficial.
The spread of respect and power in a community is influenced by certain conditions, which many observers measure by means of the economic distribution and information scales.
If a community's economic distribution becomes slanted, its middle-income groups grow smaller, and despotism stands a better chance to gain a foothold. Where land is privately owned, one sign of a poorly balanced economy is the concentration of land ownership in the hands of a very small number of people. When farmers lose their farms, they lose their independence. This one can stay on, but not as his own boss anymore. To the extent that this condition exists throughout a nation, the likelihood of despotism is increased. In communities which depend almost entirely on a single industry, such as a factory or mine, maintaining economic balance is a challenging problem. If this condition exists over the nation as a whole, so that the control of jobs and business opportunities is in a few hands, despotism stands a good chance. Another sign of a poorly balanced economy is a taxation system that presses heaviest on those least able to pay. A larger part of a small income is spent on necessities such as food. Sales taxes on such necessities hit the small income harder. In the days of the salt tax, feudal despotisms were partly sustained by this and other effects. A community rates low on an information scale when the press, radio, and other channels of communication are controlled by only a few people, and when citizens have to accept what they are told. In communities of this kind, despotism stands a good chance. See how a community trains its teachers.
Bear this in mind. Young people cannot be trusted to form their own opinions. This business about open-mindedness is nonsense. It's a waste of time trying to teach students to think for themselves. It's our job to tell them.
And when teachers put such training into practice, despotism stands a good chance. These children are being taught to accept uncritically whatever they're told. Questions are not encouraged.
How can you ask such a question? Have you got a textbook?
Yes, ma'am.
Does it say here that our law courts are always just?
Yes, ma'am.
Then how dare you question the fact? Sit down.
And so we aren't surprised when...
But it must be true. I saw it in this book right here.
And if books and newspapers and the radio are efficiently controlled, the people will read and accept exactly what the few in control want them to. Government censorship is one form of control. A newspaper which breaks a government censorship rule can be suspended. It is also possible for newspapers and other forms of communication to be controlled by private interests.
I thought I told you to kill that story. It'll cost us a lot of advertising.
If that story goes out, I quit.
All right.
What sort of community do you live in? Where would you place it on a democracy-despotism scale? To find out, you can rate it on a respect scale and a power scale. And to find out what way it is likely to go in the future, you can rate it on economic distribution and information scales. The lower your community rates on economic distribution and information scales, the lower it is likely to rate on respect and power scales, and thus to approach despotism. What happens in a single community is the problem of its own citizens. But it is also the problem of us all, because as communities go, so goes the nation.
Got on the train with $200. He couldn't see any harm in a friendly game of cards. What if the other men were strangers? And take Joe Collins. He's got a nice wife at home. But he met this girl at the bar, and she looked, after the first couple of drinks. There's a good old-fashioned word for people like us. We call them suckers. And there are other people. People who stay up nights figuring out how to take away what they've got. There are all kinds of games. Mike here, for instance. He's got everything in me. He's young, he's healthy, got a job. And he's got plenty of food. Big factories to make things a man can use. Big cities to do the business of a big company. And people. Lots of people. Enough to work the farm and build the factories, dig the mines, run the business. All kinds of people. People from different countries with different religions, different colored skins. Free people. They can live together and work together and build America together because they're free. Free to vote, to say what they please, go to their own churches, to pick their own jobs. Yeah, Mike's got something, all right. He's got America. But there are guys who stay up nights figuring out how to take that away from him.
I happen to know the facts. Now, friends, I'm just an average American. But I'm an American. And some of the things I see in this country of ours make my blood boil. I see people with foreign money. I see Negroes holding jobs that belong to me and you. Now, I ask you, if we allow this thing to go on, what's going to become of us real Americans?
I've heard this kind of talk before, but I never expected to hear it in America.
This fellow seems to know what he's talking about.
What are we real Americans going to do about it? You'll find it right here in this little pamphlet. The truth about Negroes and foreigners. The truth about the Catholic Church.
Do you believe in that kind of talk?
I don't know, makes pretty good sense to me.
And I tell you, friends, we'll never be able to call this country our own until it's a country without. Without what? Yeah, without what? Without Negroes. Without alien foreigners. Without Catholics. Without Freemasons. You know these people.
What's wrong with the Masons? I'm a Mason. Hey, that fellow's talking about me.
And that makes a difference, doesn't it?
These are your enemies. These are the people who are trying to take over our country. Now you know them. You know what they stand for. And it's up to you and me to fight them. Fight them and destroy them before they destroy us. Thank you.
Before he said Masons, you were ready to agree with him.
Well, yes, but he was talking about... What about those other people?
But in this country, we have no other people. We are American people, us.
What about you? You aren't American, are you?
I was born in Hungary, but now I am an American citizen. And I have seen what this kind of talk can do. I saw it in Berlin.
What were you doing there?
I was a professor at the university. I heard the same words we have heard today. But I was a fool then. I thought Nazis were crazy people, stupid fanatics. But unfortunately, it was not so. You see, they knew that they were not strong enough to conquer a unified country. So they split Germany into small groups. They used prejudice as a practical weapon to cripple the nation. Of course, that was not easy to do. They had to work hard to do it. You see, we human beings are not born with prejudices. Always they are made for us, made by someone who wants something. Remember that when you hear this kind of talk. Somebody is going to get something out of it, and it isn't going to be you. This is not classroom theory. I saw it happen. I saw it first in Berlin in 1932. 5 young men that I knew were standing in the crowd listening to the Nazi speaker. Eric was a Catholic. Anton, a student of mine, was a Jew. Heinrich owned a small hardware store. Karl was a farmer. And Hans was an unemployed metal worker.
To all Bohemian Germans, I say it is time you inherited the nation which rightfully belongs to you. To you alone belongs the glorious destiny of the greater Germany. The Nazi Party will provide land for the farmer, work for the worker, and profits for the small businessman. Who is getting these things now? The Jew. The Jew who has stolen our nation and our birthright. Who makes all the money and takes all our jobs? The Jew! He must be shunned. He must be ostracized. He must be eliminated. And the Catholics. We don't want our great nation run by a foreign church. We Germans will know what to do with these people when the time comes. They and their faith must be destroyed. Then there are the Freemasons. In Germany, we have no place for secret societies. There may be only one society, and that is the Nazi Party. There may be no secrecy about that in the new Greater Germany.
One by one, he attacked each minority and he split them off one from the other. These men were all fellow Germans when they came here today. Now they were split into rival groups, suspicious of each other, hating each other. They were being swindled, all of them. But the man who was really being fooled was Hans. He was pure German, according to Nazi standards. To him they promised everything, and he fell for it. That's how Hans became a Superman. They gave him a uniform and they pumped up his ego. He wasn't just a little fellow out of work anymore. He was a member of the master race. Hans and thousands of others like him, all playing a sucker's game. They gambled with other people's liberty, and of course they lost their own. A nation of suckers. Hitler needed these people. There was lots of work to be done. There were trade unions to be smashed, because unions were organized and might offer resistance. There were many political parties in Germany. These the Nazis destroyed. They were determined to smash every organization where people might band together and resist them. There were Jews to be beaten and killed. The Jews were not powerful, but they were a convenient excuse for all the nation's ills. And besides, a Nazi party member could not take over this man's store. Hundreds of Catholics were put in jail because the Catholic Church had strength and could resist the Nazi drive for power. They had split the nation into 100 pieces, and then one by one, they had destroyed the pieces. Over these broken pieces, the Nazis rode into power. One party, one nation, one religion. These men had won their struggle for power. They now ruled all of Germany. But still they had trouble with their oldest and most persistent enemy, the truth. They found that truth does not die easily, and so they decided to abolish truth. One great source of truth is literature, so they burned books, 20 million of them. Many great men in Germany who were spokesmen for truth were jailed or driven from their country. Teachers, writers, scientists. Education was discouraged. In 5 years, college attendance dropped 53%. It was forbidden to listen to a British radio program or read an American newspaper. In Nazi Germany, you had to get your information from Dr. Goebbels. He knew what was best for you. The church was one force in Germany still strong enough to proclaim the truth in public. This Catholic priest was arrested the following day on charges of immorality. The Protestant church also continued to try and fight for truth. The Nazis put this man in a concentration camp. There were others who spoke for truth, and I am proud to say that educators were among them.
And what, may I ask, is an Aryan? I don't know myself. But let us see what our present so-called authorities have to say about it. They say he is tall, slender, blue-eyed, and blonde. There is no Aryan race. And more important, there is no master race. There are people who may find these ideas convenient, but science cannot support them. There is no scientific proof that there's any correlation between a man's racial characteristics and his native ability or character. In all racial groups, we find the same range of potentialities. We find idiots and geniuses. We find criminals and philanthropists. We must judge each man as an individual, and not by the color of his skin, or his eyes, or by the length of his nose. Come in, gentlemen. It's comfortable. And remember that there is no master race. That is a scientific truth. Anyone who tells you otherwise is lying.
And so for all practical purposes, truth had been abolished in Germany. A lot of my German friends wondered what had hit them. How did it happen? Where did it start? It started right here. And this was where it could have been stopped. If those people had stood together, if they had protected each other, they could have resisted the Nazi threat. Together they would have been strong. But once they allowed themselves to be split apart, they were helpless. When that first minority lost out, everybody lost out. They made the mistake of gambling with other people's freedom. Now let's see how those bets paid off. Karl the farmer was gambling on a better life for himself. What he got was extra hours of back-breaking work, as much as 100 hours a week. He was forced to stay on his land and produce what he was told to produce, because now Hitler was preparing for war. For Heinrich, who owned a hardware store, the bet didn't pay off either. 104,000 small businesses were closed in 2 years. And for Hans, conditions hadn't improved any. He had a job now in the munitions factory, but he worked long hours for little pay. The working conditions grew increasingly bad. And even though he didn't like the job, he wasn't permitted to leave it. And when Hitler decided the time was right, Germany went to war. Not by declaring war, but by a carefully prepared sneak attack. Once again, Hitler needed Hans to do his dirty work. Hans was an expert at brutality this time, and Hitler had decided to use Hans and his brutality against other peoples, the Czechs, the Poles, the French, the Russians. But in the crucial test of war, Hitler's race theories didn't pay off. His pure-blooded supermen were defeated by the mongrel armies he despised. By the British of El Alamein. By the Russians at Stalingrad. Then on D-Day by American soldiers of every color and religion, who smashed across the Normandy beaches and drove on through to the heart of Germany. For the misguided Germans who had swallowed the Nazi bait, the Nazi game did not pay off. The continent of Europe was strewn with millions of German bodies, pure Aryan bodies. Karl the farmer was left in the snow outside of Moscow. Heinrich stayed in Italy at Salerno. And Hans, who was going to rule the world, got only a little patch of Normandy that he could call his own.
We must never let that happen to us or to our country. We must never let ourselves be divided by race or color or religion, because in this country we all belong to minority groups. I was born in Hungary. You are a Mason. These are minorities. And then you belong to other minority groups too. You are a farmer. You have blue eyes. You go to the Methodist Church. Your right to belong to these minorities is a precious thing. You have a right to be what you are and say what you think, because here we have personal freedom. We have liberty. And these are not just fancy words. This is a practical and priceless way of living. But we must work at it. We must guard everyone's liberty, or we can lose our own. If we allow any minority to lose its freedom by persecution or by prejudice, we are threatening our own freedom. And this is not simply an ideal. This is good, hard common sense. You see, Here in America is not a question whether we tolerate minorities. America is minorities. And that means you and me. So let's not be suckers. We must not allow the freedom or dignity of any man to be threatened by any act or word. Let's be selfish about it. Let's forget about we and they. Let's think about us.
This is the story of your enslavement. How it came to be, and how you can finally be free. Like all animals, human beings want to dominate and exploit the resources around them. At first, we mostly hunted and fished and ate off the land, but then something magical and terrible happened to our minds. We became, alone among the animals, afraid of death and of future loss. And this was the start of a great tragedy and an even greater possibility. You see, when we become afraid of death, of injury and imprisonment, we become controllable and so valuable in a way that no other resource could ever be. The greatest resource for any human being to control is not natural resources or tools or animals or land, but other human beings. You can frighten an animal because animals are afraid of pain in the moment, but you cannot frighten an animal with a loss of liberty, with torture or imprisonment in the future, because animals have very little sense of tomorrow. You cannot threaten a cow with torture or a sheep with death. You cannot swing a sword at a tree and scream at it to produce more fruit, or hold a burning torch to a field and demand more wheat. You cannot get more eggs by threatening a hen, but you can get a man to give you his eggs by threatening him. This human farming has been the most profitable and destructive occupation throughout history, and it is now reaching its destructive climax. Human society cannot be rationally understood until it is seen for what it is: a series of farms where human farmers own human livestock. Some people get confused because governments provide healthcare and water and education and roads, and thus imagine that there is some benevolence at work. Nothing could be further from the reality. Farmers provide healthcare and irrigation and training to their livestock. Some people get confused because we are allowed certain liberties and thus imagine that our governments protect our freedoms. But farmers plant their crops a certain distance apart to increase their yields, and will allow certain animals larger stalls or fields if it means they will produce more meat and milk. In your country, your tax farm, your farmer grants you certain freedoms, not because he cares about your liberties, but because he wants to increase his profits. Are you beginning to see the nature of the cage you were born into? There have been 4 major phases of human farming. The first phase in ancient Egypt was direct and brutal human compulsion. Human bodies were controlled, but the creative productivity of the human mind remained beyond the reach of the whip and the brand and the shackles. Slaves remained woefully underproductive and required enormous resources to control. The second phase was the Roman model, wherein slaves were granted some capacity for freedom, ingenuity, and creativity, which raised their productivity. This increased the wealth of Rome, and thus the tax income of the Roman government, and with this additional wealth, Rome became an empire, destroying the economic freedoms that fed its power, and collapsed. I'm sure that this does not seem entirely unfamiliar. After the collapse of Rome, the feudal model introduced the concept of livestock ownership and taxation. Instead of being directly owned, peasants farmed land that they could retain as long as they paid off the local warlords. This model eventually broke down due to the continual subdivision of productive land and was destroyed during the enclosure movement when land was consolidated and hundreds of thousands of peasants were kicked off their ancestral lands because new farming techniques made larger farms more productive with fewer people. The increased productivity of the later Middle Ages created the excess food required for the expansion of towns and cities, which in turn gave rise to the modern democratic model of human ownership. As displaced peasants flooded into the cities, a huge stock of cheap human capital became available to the rising industrialists. And the ruling class of human farmers quickly realized that they could make more money by letting their livestock choose their own occupations. Under the democratic model, direct slave ownership has been replaced by the mafia model. The mafia rarely owns businesses directly, but rather sends thugs around once a month to steal from the business owners. You are now allowed to choose your own occupation, which raises your productivity, and thus the taxes you can pay to your masters. Your few freedoms are preserved because they are profitable to your owners. The great challenge of the democratic model is that increases in wealth and freedom threaten the farmers. The ruling classes initially profit from a relatively free market in capital and labor, but as their livestock become more used to their freedoms and growing wealth, they begin to question why they need rulers at all. Well, nobody ever said that human farming was easy. Keeping the taxed livestock securely in the compounds of the ruling classes is a three-phase process. The first is to indoctrinate the young through government, quote, education. As the wealth of democratic countries grew, government schools were universally inflicted in order to control the thoughts and souls of the livestock. The second phase is to turn citizens against each other through the creation of dependent livestock. It is very difficult to rule human beings directly through force, and where it can be achieved, it remains cripplingly underproductive, as can be seen in North Korea. Human beings do not breed well or produce efficiently in direct captivity. But if human beings believe that they are free, then they will produce much more for their farmers. The best way to maintain this illusion of freedom is to put some of the livestock on the payroll of the farmer. Those cows that become dependent on the existing hierarchy will then attack any other cows who point out the violence, hypocrisy, and immorality of human ownership.
Officers positioned Grant face first on the floor with one officer near his head, a second near his back, and a third officer standing nearby. There appeared to be a brief struggle. Then, a 2-year veteran BART officer stands, draws his weapon, and fires.
Freedom is slavery, and slavery is freedom. If you can get the cows to attack each other whenever anybody brings up the reality of their situation, then you don't have to spend nearly as much controlling them directly. Those cows who become dependent upon the stolen largesse of the farmer will violently oppose any questioning of the virtue of human ownership. And the intellectual and artistic classes, always and forever dependent upon the farmers, will say to anyone who demands freedom from ownership, "You will harm your fellow cows." The livestock are thus kept enclosed by shifting the moral responsibility for the destructiveness of the violent system to those who demand real freedom. The third phase is to invent continual external threats so that the frightened livestock cling to the protection of the farmers. This system of human farming is now nearing its end. The terrible tragedies of modern Western economic systems has occurred not in spite of, but because of past economic freedoms. The massive increases in Western wealth throughout the 19th century resulted from economic freedoms. And it was this very increase in wealth that fed the size and power of the state. Whenever the livestock become exponentially more productive, you get a corresponding increase in the number of farmers and their dependents. The growth of the state is always proportional to the preceding economic freedoms. Economic freedoms create wealth, and the wealth attracts more thieves and political parasites, whose greed then destroys the economic freedoms. In other words, freedom metastasizes the cancer of the state. The government that starts off the smallest will always end up the largest. This is why there can be no viable and sustainable alternative to a truly free and peaceful society. A society without political rulers, without human ownership, without the violence of taxation and statism. To be truly free is both very easy and very hard. We avoid the horror of our enslavement because it is so painful to see it directly. We dance around the endless violence of our dying system because we fear the attacks of our fellow livestock. But we can only be kept in the cages we refuse to see. Wake up. To see the farm is to leave it.
Contrary to what many people assume, most of the suffering, injustice, and conflict in the world is not the result of greed, hatred, or intolerance. Instead, most of man's inhumanity to man is the result of one particular belief, one irrational superstition, which is shared by almost everyone, namely, the belief in authority. Most theft, assault, and murder in the world is not carried out by individuals acting on their own malice, but by individuals who were obeying the orders of so-called governments. The worst atrocities in history were the result of a very small number of truly nasty people acquiring positions of power, combined with a very large number of average people who viewed those few people as authority, and so felt obligated to obey their commands. It has always been the law-abiding taxpayers who have funded and empowered oppressive regimes. The problem is that most good people have fallen for the lie that when aggression, robbery, and control is committed in the name of law, then it is legitimate and moral, even necessary. The belief in authority tricks basically good people into going along with legalized injustice. Most children are taught that obedience to authority is a virtue, and even most adults still think that bowing to a ruling class, which they call obeying the law, is what makes someone a good person. It's not. On the contrary, being a moral human being requires understanding right and wrong, and doing the right thing, even when authority tells you not to. The basic rules for being a good person are very simple. Treat every other person as if he owns himself, because he does. This means you shouldn't attack, rob, or otherwise initiate violence against anyone. In other words, you shouldn't start a fight. If someone else attacks you, you have the right to defend yourself, but no one has the right to be an attacker. Badges, uniforms, and so-called laws do not change this fact. There is virtue in respecting the rights and property of others. There is no virtue in obeying the law just for the sake of being obedient. Sometimes a law happens to match morality, such as laws against murder. But the reason murder is bad is not because politicians wrote a law about it. Murder is wrong because it violates the self-ownership of the victim. If laws against murder were repealed tomorrow, or if a law was passed commanding some people to commit murder, as has happened over and over again throughout history, murder would still be wrong. Indeed, there are many historical examples where the good people were the criminals, the lawbreakers, the rebels, and traitors to their so-called governments. When the law goes against what is moral and righteous, then it is the duty of every decent person to disobey and resist. These days, few dare to stand up to any supposed authority. Instead, people are trained to participate in elections and politics, which amounts to begging the masters to please be nicer, as if we shouldn't do what we know is right unless and until the politicians give us permission to. Not only that, but decent people are also tricked into believing that it is perfectly acceptable and righteous to control and rob their neighbors as long as they do it by way of voting and the political process. In short, the political process is designed to dupe the people into cooperating with and even demanding their own subjugation and the subjugation of everyone else. As long as those in power can trick people into arguing over how government power should be used, arguing over who should be robbed and how much, arguing over who should be bossed around and controlled, then the masses will always be at war with each other and will keep empowering tyrants and throwing away their own freedom. Even otherwise good people feel no guilt about condoning that their fellow man be robbed and dominated, because they've been taught that when extortion and coercion is called taxation and law enforcement, that it is not only moral and proper, but is necessary for society. Only very rarely do people recognize that the only way they will ever have freedom themselves is to allow everyone else, including people they don't like, don't approve of, and have little in common with, to also be free. As long as people keep playing the game where they argue over which power-happy political opportunist should be running things, there will be no freedom or justice for anyone. Every government in the world legalizes aggression and extortion. Every so-called tax or other law is a threat of violence. On one level, everyone knows this. The politicians, by way of the legislative process, tell everyone else what they must do or what they may not do, and anyone who gets caught disobeying will be robbed or caged in the name of the law. The old notion of the divine right of kings has changed into the divine right of politicians, with similar results. Indeed, the belief in government is essentially a religion, the most dangerous and destructive religion ever. Hundreds of millions of human beings have been murdered by their own governments. Many millions more have died in government-created wars, and billions more have been robbed, harassed, terrorized, and otherwise forcibly dominated and oppressed by ruling classes, including democratically elected constitutional governments. Yes, sometimes agents of government will try to stop other aggressors, but every government is itself a gang of thieves and thugs. In fact, private thieves could never steal anywhere near the amount of wealth that government confiscates via taxes, and the wars waged by government completely dwarf the murder and violence committed by private thugs. Of course, there are nasty people in the world, and there still would be without government. And the good people need to have the ability and willingness to defend against such people. But organizing for self-defense is not, in and of itself, what government is. Instead, government is the idea that some people can have the moral right to rule everyone else, that constitutions, elections, and other rituals give some people an exemption from basic morality and make it okay for them to boss around other people under threat of force. The idea that we need to give a group of people permission to forcibly rob and control us so they can protect us from those who might forcibly rob and control us is ridiculous. And yet most people believe exactly that. They believe that we need government, the biggest thug and thief around, to protect us from thugs and thieves. To make this sound less absurd, the people are taught nonsensical mythology about democracy, representative government, and the consent of the governed. But there are several ways to easily prove that government cannot possibly be legitimate, never has been, and never will be. For example, people obviously cannot delegate rights they don't have themselves. If you do not have the right to rob your neighbor on your own, then you can't possibly give such a right to some public official, nor can anyone else. No election, no constitution, no political process can make robbery and extortion moral and righteous, even if politicians first do a bunch of complicated pseudo-religious rituals and then call the robbery law and taxation. It is also easy to prove that the only thing government adds to society, or will ever add to society, is more immoral violence. In short, anything that is inherently righteous, people being productive, working together, voluntarily cooperating and organizing, defending themselves from attackers and thieves, these things don't require any special authority. You don't need a badge or a uniform. You don't need to be elected or appointed in order to have the right to do things which are already righteous and good. The only thing that so-called authority is needed for is to do things which normal people do not have the right to do, to try to authorize and legitimize acts that would be wrong if done by normal people. In other words, so-called authority is nothing more than permission to do bad things.
You are watching a Paradigm Shift in Educational Comedy Special Edition presentation designed for broadcasting on Conscious Consumer Network Independent TV. These special edition segments are meant to take the best of Paradigm Shift in Educational Comedy, mixing and mashing the clips and redesigning them into a brand new derivative work for the purpose of both informing you and entertaining you. Each show will also air on the psecdocumentary YouTube channel 1 week after they are streamed on CCN. It is our intention to inspire others to view the negative as a positive opportunity for positive change, because without compassion in our actions, one is merely aware, but not necessarily awake. A platform of compassion and not falling for divide and conquer division tactics is the only way to bring in a new and better world that is not run by psychopaths. Speaking of psychopaths, we are here with Slick Willie, aka former President Bill Clinton. Mr. Clinton, has the rise of compassion within the human spirit caused any interference with your ability to rape women and molest children? And has this created any unforeseen phenomenon while you and your buddies worship that funky-looking stone owl during your cremation of care ceremonies at Bohemian Grove?
Well, Mr. Kelso, I tell you, this new conscious energy has been really hard on me and my wife Hillary. It's making it very, very difficult for me to do my presidential rape campaign. It's making it very difficult for me to keep it up anymore. I got to keep a line of Viagra constantly flowing into my veins to get it up. I can't even rape children like I used to. I've partaken in a lot of crazy shenanigans over the years, but 2017 has been one triggering year for me and the old pig. I mean, Hillary. My wife has become uglier and uglier and uglier. I have to put a bag over her head just to stick my slick in there. I'm afraid I might get diseased. After all, she's been on the campaign so long, she's starting to get AIDS or some sort of contraction of some sexual disease, that carpet munching pig. It just drives me nuts. My daughter, she's out banging more dicks than I know what to do with, including mine. My buddy Dick Cheney, we went out on a hunting trip, not a hunting accident. He has a tendency to have those every now and again out around the Bohemian Grove grounds, and these energies have been so harsh that the gun accidentally malfired and shot my dick off, and I had to get surgery done. It's now this robotic replacement now, and it sometimes has an electronic spasm and goes out of control, and I can't fucking stop it. It's like the Slick 5000, but as to the political stage, it's very confusing. Vladimir makes fun of me. He likes to leave uranium-encrusted dog shit on my porch, and he likes to harass me and make fun of me and laugh at me and tell me that I'm a loser, that I lost the election, and he calls me a little bitch boy. It really hurts my feelings, and I thought I was going to be able to rub it in his face. I was going to rub it in Putin's face. I'm really triggered. These energies are really triggered. It's not fair. It's not fair. My wife should have been the president, Madam President. I should have been the first man. I mean, the first bitch. I mean the first whore. I mean, the first man. I want to be screwing interns again. Not even a drip of Viagra on an IV can help me anymore. I can't. I'm just losing my mind. It's just getting crazy for me. I just can't do it. I feel like I'm going insane. Like my body's corroding and collapsing on me. I just can't do it. Now I'm on. Oh my God! I think he's dead. Dave, I think you killed Clinton.
So much for a new world order, but based on what he was describing, sounds like maybe there's a bit of new world odor going on.
His corpse looks like a bag of odors and tricks. Yeesh. I'm gonna have to clean that shit up. Oh, and now it's leaking Viagra encrusted diarrhea all over my floor. Oh. But I'm shit in educational comedy.
Situational comedy. Yeah, well, there you have it, folks. The rise of compassion is just taking those psychopaths and they're just becoming triggered little zombies that are just, yeah. Although don't worry, we'll be seeing Bill again. I'm sure they got a clone of him in the frozen locker, someplace, or so they say.
It's your heart and soul, it's your flesh and bones. Don't you let it go. You're the storm I find, bursting through my sky, taking all control. It's your heart and soul. It's your heart and soul. We'll be shining tonight. We'll be be shining, we'll be shining, we'll be shining tonight. We'll be shining, we'll be shining, we'll be shining tonight.